What did they say in Hollywood? Lights, camera, action.
That's right. Break a leg.
Oh, how did you know that one?
Oh, I can't hear you, Kimberly.
We are broadcasting as of now.
Okay.
But the jokey's okay. Stephen can edit out the sound. It's fine. All right, let's do this. Thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium. This is session number 365, titled Entheogens in Occult Traditions and the Visionary First World. Entheogens in Occult Traditions and the Visionary World of First Nephi. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. The panelists have both indicated they would like to wait for the end of the session for Q&A, and that they will be available after in the Hangout for the room to answer any questions that are unanswered at the end of the session. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation. Post-enlightenment magic and occult grimoires and handbooks seamlessly blend the spiritual and physical, often obscuring naturalistic mechanisms to achieve incantations, spells, hexes, or conjurations. The Book of Mormon similarly blends the spiritual and physical to obscure the presence of entheogens to uninitiated readers. Early Mormon experiences suggest the use of hallucinogenic substances common at the time. The First Book of Nephi's first episodes revolve around Lehi's visions, and then a complex serial vision from his son, Nephi. Both suggest hallucinogen use. In the latter part of First Nephi, there is an active debate on the role of visions. I'll take a second to introduce you to our speakers before we begin. Bryce K. Blankenagel has hosted the weekly Naked Mormon podcast and co-hosted the weekly My Book of Mormon podcast and the bi-weekly Glass Box podcast, among many others. Whew. He has presented at the Sunstone Symposium and the John Whitmer Historical Association Conference and has published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, among others. Brian W. Kassenbrock has studied both in the USA and abroad. He has a background in American history, science, and German literature. He has presented at the Sunstone Symposium and the John Whitmer Historical Association Conference and published in the JWHA Journal. He is currently researching the role of Hermeticism and hallucinogenics in early Mormonism. I will now give the floor to our presenters. All right, take it away, guys.
We on?
You're on.
Okay, good, awesome.
Glass of water.
All right, hi everybody. Let me make sure I'm sharing my slide correctly here. Is that looking good, moderator? We all set? Awesome. Okay. Thank you everybody for attending this presentation on entheogens in occult traditions and the visionary world of First Nephi. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and I'm here to discuss entheogens and psychedelics in occult traditions. And later you're going to be hearing from my co-presenter, Brian Kassenbrock, who is going to take us through a brief rundown of the visionary First Book of Nephi. I also want to thank Sunstone Foundation for moving to an online format this year for this year's symposium. It's certainly quite the technical feat, and it's been relatively seamless and a great experience so far. So Here's an outline of what we're going to discuss today on my presentation. First, what are entheogens and psychedelics? Then we're going to get into these plant medicines in herbal remedies stemming from the Enlightenment era. After that, we're going to jump into entheogens and psychedelics in occult traditions and use that as a springboard to discuss how Lucy Mack Smith passed entheogens through her book, Biographical Sketches of the Prophet Joseph Smith, in the form of Joseph Sr.'s dreams. And we'll spend some time talking about the effects of the specific entheogen that she described. And then we'll finish with a brief conclusion before I hand it over to Brian. And this presentation may go over a few minutes because I'm an insufferable windbag. What can I say? So if everybody's ready to get started, let's just jump right in. Let's get our terminology straight. Entheogen is a combination of entheos, meaning inspired or possessed by God, and genesthai, to come into being. So psychedelics is the colloquial term for recreational use, while entheogen refers to using plant medicines for ritualistic purposes. Using entheogens in a proper set and setting, meaning your mindset and the time and place in which you use them, has a high likelihood of inspiring theophany in the mind of the user. And theophany, of course, is meaning like a deeply profound spiritual or mystical or a transcendent experience. Now, an important detail here, and one of the central points of the Smith entheogen thesis, is the need for and the utility of a shaman. A shaman is a guide to help those who partake to have the experience that the shaman directs. Shamans create a conducive set, a mindset, and setting for theophany, usually using some form of ritualism, be they hymns, sacrament, whatever the case may be. Now, people under the influence of psychedelics and these entheogenic plants are highly suggestible, and they're often not very well tethered to reality. Their mind can go to all sorts of dark places during the entheogenic session. So a practiced shaman is a person who can help the people see and experience the session in a positive way. Now, not all shamans are alike. Under the influence of entheogens, people can be persuaded to see and to experience and to do many things that they otherwise might not. For the hours a person is under the influence, a shaman can help the person feel the deepest senses of grief and gratitude they've ever experienced. I believe that Joseph Smith was a shaman, particularly in the Kirtland era of early Mormonism. So what are these plants? When taken, these plants create in the mind of the user what we call non-ordinary reality or altered states of consciousness, which can be achieved without the plants, but the plants help to facilitate them. The experiences completely defy description. Many will perceive a version of reality that simply isn't there. And we can understand descriptions of these non-ordinary states of mind or these altered states of consciousness with today's terminology that phrases people use, like the dissolution of their ego. They see a hallucination, or they see the face of God. They feel a sense of infinite love and compassion, or they hallucinate fractals. But when we're looking back to the 19th century, we need to understand the terminology that they used, which are terms like deleterious or intoxication or giddiness, or these plants pervert all the rational faculties, or they cause madness, or certain plants have narcotic properties. And that's all within the medical sense of the herbal books at the time. If we're talking about in the occult sense, we have terms like celestial gifts, divine inspiration, enchantments, sorceries. And those are the terms used in the occult traditions to describe psychoactive effects. So a specific group of entheogens are going to be our focus today, and that is the nightshade family. Now, these were known as the hexing herbs or the witching ointments, and this is the nightshade family. The Solanaceae family that we know as nightshades, it's comprised of over 2,500 different plants. Staple crops like potatoes and tomatoes, those are nightshade plants, but we're going to focus on the nightshades most known for being distilled into oils to be used as topical ointments, or being infused into alcohol or tea or wine in order to make psychoactive tinctures. These hexing herbs are hellebore, mandrake, belladonna, henbane, and specifically our focus, Datura. Datura is going to be the entheogen that we discuss near the end when we get to talking about Joseph Sr.'s dreams and Lucy Mack Smith passing that information. On this slide, you can see various screenshots of herbal remedy books from the late 18th and early 19th centuries published in America, which discuss Datura, and some of them even include picture plates. We have the common names Datura stramonium. Of course, stramonium is just a specific species of Datura, but the colloquial terms are thornapple, Jimson weed or Jamestown weed, stinkweed, moonflower, devil's weed, or the Arabic or German denominations of those words. So Jacob Bigelow was one of these herbal physicians who published an herbal remedy book called Materia Medica. This was published in Boston in 1822. This is what Jacob Bigelow says, quote, Datura is a powerful narcotic. It produces nausea and dizziness, but if the quantity be large, it brings on great prostration of strength, loss of muscular power, insensibility of the retina, occasioning the dilated pupil, tremors, headache, delirium, and sometimes, this is where it turns dark, sometimes convulsions, coma, and death. He goes on to say, if not fatal, the effects wear off in a day or two, creating phenomena like those of intoxication. Now, all of these listed symptoms are known as common effects of anticholinergic drugs, anticholinergic being the neurochemical process which creates these symptoms. And Datura is extensively discussed, and many of the nightshades are discussed in many of these herbal remedy books. And occult books alluded to or explicitly dealt with Datura as well as many other members of the nightshade family, and did so sometimes using coded language. So let's talk about the medical side of herbal remedies. Medical books became extremely popular with the advent of the printing press and during the early Enlightenment era. We're going to focus on the 1700s. John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, published his own proprietary herbal remedy book titled Primitive Physic. And that was published in the 1740s when Methodism was beginning to gain traction all over Europe and in the early American colonies. Now, this book was widely circulated, Primitive Physic. I found over 20 different editions, and that was just with a cursory search. So that means that it wasn't uncommon for a Methodist to have a copy of Primitive Physic, this herbal remedy book, on their bookshelf next to their Bible. We also have Medicina Britannica by Thomas Short from 1746, and that includes hundreds of herbs and their descriptions, their psychoactive effects, and even picture plates in order to help identify what the plants look like. And he talks about the nightshade family as well. Quote, henbane is a great narcotic, but it disturbs and perverts all the rational faculties and causes madness. If taken in too great a quantity, it causes certain death. He also included picture plates and passages about mandrake and hellebore, two other members of the nightshade family, as well as hemp, cannabis. We also have The History of Drugs by Pierre Pomey in 1748. Like, these herbal remedy books are a dime a dozen in the late 18th and early 19th century. And just the ones that we're talking about, just these three books, just these three specimens come from a single decade, just the 1740s. Eventually, herbal medicine was streamlined in America to become Thomsonian medicine. Willard Richards, Frederick G. Williams, John C. Bennett, Robert D. Foster, Samuel Bennett, all of these guys and many others were in leadership positions in the church, and all of them were herbal physicians, some of them being Thomsonian herbal physicians. Even Frederick G. Williams, Joseph Smith's own son, was named after Frederick G. Williams when Frederick was in the presidency of the church. And this list of people who were herbal physicians, technically physicians, in the church is far from complete. This is just a cursory list of them, but it should also be noted that people didn't necessarily have to be practicing herbal physicians to have a familiarity and an understanding of herbalism, right? So one of the greatest uses of Thomsonian herbal physician books is the directories at the end. So Samuel Thompson gives a scientific name for each plant and where to find it in the book. It's an index, right? As well as the colloquial names to which certain herbs may be referred. So in his book, in his directories, he has like Noah's Ark and moccasin flower or king's cure or dog's fennel or Virginia snake root or clabbergrass or dragon root. These were all the cultural names that were given to specific plants and herbs, and only those people in the know knew what to look for. So psychedelics used entheogenically and herbal remedies, they were sacred knowledge to many of these herbal physicians and the people who had a familiarity with herbalism, especially in occult traditions. So herbal remedies, herbal remedies kept families alive. they also were able to provide entheogenic intoxication, which could be used for ritualistic purposes. Users of these plants often coded their language and used these colloquial terms to describe the ingredients for various tinctures and potions and ointments and teas and whatever way you're partaking of these. So when I say like something like a witch's potion, what comes to mind? Is this what we think about when we hear the term witch's potion? You know, eye of newt or cow's tongue or salamander's gizzard. Those are hilarious ingredients, right? But the point that I'm making here, the practitioners of occult herbal remedies weren't actually scavenging the forest and plucking out the eyes of newts. Those were code words used for herbs that only initiates, only the people reading with this with their spiritual eyes could use to identify the right plants. Entheogens were sacred medicines and still are to this day. They're sacred medicines to connect people with what they perceive as the divine. So herbal remedies that we often write off as folk medicine, it's a rich tradition with a deep and vast knowledge base, including barriers of entry to the most guarded secrets for those entheogen users. Knowing what plants are medicinal or what herbs taste good with a stew or what plants can kill you, and more importantly, what plants can be used entheogenically to connect one with the divine, it's a massive skill set and it shouldn't just be disregarded or casually thrown away. And this information, this skill set is often passed through code names, cryptic language, as well as allegory. So let's talk about entheogens in occult traditions. Here on the picture plate, we have Henry Cornelius Agrippa, we have Francis Barrett, and we have Ebenezer Sibley. Each of these occult philosophers wrote their treatises on occultism, and all of them included extensive sections on herbalism and commentary on the uses and dangers of psychedelic drugs and entheogens. The extent to which people were steeped in occultism, they were often steeped in the use of plants and herbs, which also included entheogens. And historians, I mean, Lance Owens, D. Michael Quinn, Dan Vogel, and scores of others have abundantly demonstrated the occult influence on the Smith family and many 19th century Americans. And that dates all the way back to B.H. Roberts, right? Unfortunately, the psychedelic aspect of occult magicians remains largely overlooked by the current body of Mormon historians. Because Mormon historians don't do drugs, right? So if we're granting the magic worldview of Joseph Smith and many early Mormons, we must seriously consider entheogen and psychedelic use. So let's go through each of these occult philosophers. Ebenezer Sibley, let's start with him. He published in 1790 an herbal physician book that he wrote with a guy named Nicholas Culpeper, and it is titled Culpeper's English Physician and Complete Herbal, to which are now added upwards of 100 additional herbs with a display of their medicinal and occult properties. First off, needs an editor, but that's very important because Ebenezer Sibley was the illustrator for the picture plates at the end of the book, and it describes the occult properties of the plants. That means the ruling planets of those plants. So most of the plants in this 1790 Herbal Physician Occult and Medicinal Property book include the ruling planets of Venus or Saturn or Jupiter over the various plants. And these coincided with the vegetative, the flowering, and the harvesting phases of these plants as they vary among different types of different families of plants. So these herbal occult books like Ebenezer Sibley's could be used in conjunction with almanacs to know when and where to find and harvest various plants when their psychoactive profile is most powerful or possibly even less deadly. We have Francis Barrett's The Magus, page 29, quote, "The juice of deadly nightshade makes the party imagine almost whatever you choose." Now, that's an important passage because it highlights the role of a shaman. The shaman is the person who chooses what the person who ingested the deadly nightshade sees. The shaman helps the person imagine whatever the shaman chooses for them to see. And then let's talk about Agrippa, right? He's known as the father of modern occultism. He lived from 1486 to 1535, and he authored the 3-book Occult Philosophy. Chapter 24, page 100 of this book, these books list the plants that are governed by Jupiter, which was Joseph Smith's ruling planet, one of which is the witching ointment, henbane, right? A member of the nightshade family. Now, I want to read an important passage from Agrippa's book here because it describes the utility and the effects of entheogens, specifically that of nightshades like Datura. Now I'm going to read the passage kind of slowly and tease apart the passage as we go and try to kind of demystify and decode it. And this is from chapter 43, pages 132 to 133. And the chapter is titled "Of Perfumes or Suffumigations, Their Manner and Power." Now, perfumes, of course, we understand that that's something you spray on your wrist and it smells good. Perfumes also, the interpretation here is plants being infused into topical ointments. And then suffumigation is smoking, to smoke herbs. So this is what Agrippa says, and also talks about, their manner and power, right? Quote, "Some suffumigations, smoking, that are proper to the stars," talking about the ruling planet, "are of great force for the opportune receiving of celestial gifts under the rays of the stars." There's that phrase, celestial gifts. So he says explicitly, people smoke these herbs to get the celestial gifts. He continues, "Suffumigations are wont to be used by them that are about to soothsay or predict, which suffumigations indeed do fit us to receive divine inspiration." So people who are wanting to soothsay, wanting to predict, people who want to receive divine inspiration, they suffumigate these various herbs. "So they say that fumes doth make one to foresee things to come, and doth conduce to prophesying." Prophet, seer, and revelator, right? Suffumigations help people prophesy. Then he continues, "By certain vapors, airy spirits are presently raised, as also thunderings and lightnings and such things." Meaning that when you vaporize, when you smoke these herbs and inhale it, they cause visual and auditory hallucinations. Airy spirits are raised, seemingly from nothing, as well as thunderings and lightnings. You hear the hallucinations. He continues, "So they say that if henbane and hemlock be made to fume, that spirits will presently come together. Hence they are called spirits' herbs. The juice of hemlock and henbane makes spirits and strange shapes appear." I mean, anybody who has taken psychedelics, especially if they've dabbled into this darker side of nightshades, you know what he's talking about. The hallucinatory, the spirits being brought together. They just appear out of seemingly nothing. So he talks also about these herbs inducing hypnotic trances where the victim actually perceives themselves as an animal, or they fall in love, known as a love filter, or they perceive literal changes of solid objects into living things. And here's a somewhat, I don't know, kind of a humorous story that he relates in here. And it talks about a person who was using cheese that was drugged. He says that the person put sorceries in the cheese. Quote, "The same opinion was of Austin. He saith, whilst he was in Italy, he heard of some women that by giving sorceries in cheese, by drugging the cheese to travelers, turned them into working cattle. And when they had done such work as they would have them, turned them into men again." Right? So they didn't literally polymorph into beasts of burden and do work around the farm for these women, but they were just induced into a hypnotic trance, and the women got these guys to do some work around the house, and then once the spell wore off, then they'd go about their way, right? And there's another passage in here. It says, quote, "The scriptures themselves testify that Pharaoh's sorcerers turned their rods into serpents and water into blood and did other such like things." And that's an interesting passage because psychedelics researchers have long postulated that the Bible contains various passages which describe entheogens, whether that's John on the Isle of Patmos writing the book of Revelation, whether that's Moses on the mountain, the Israelites eating manna, or divine healings by Jesus. It turns out that modern psychedelics researchers are just building on a hypothesis formed by Agrippa in the early 16th century. I believe that Lucy Mack Smith utilized this faculty of Abrac and left breadcrumbs for adept readers in the form of Joseph Sr.'s dreams. And one of the 5 reported dreams is similar to Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon, which my co-presenter will be getting into a little bit more in his presentation. There is a plant here that matches the description of a Datura plant, and it's prominently the central focus of the dream. Quote, I was traveling in an open and desolate field, which appeared to be very barren. Beyond me was a low but very pleasant valley in which stood a tree, such as I had never seen before. Here's where the tree becomes the central focus of this vision. It was exceedingly handsome, insomuch that I looked upon it with wonder and admiration. Its beautiful branches spread themselves somewhat like an umbrella. And, here's an important part, it bore a kind of fruit in much like the shape of a chestnut burr, and as white as snow, or if possible, whiter. Now, a chestnut burr is a little spiked seed pod that is green, and as it matures, when it comes to the Datura plant, the seed pod turns white and the sides open up, and the seeds shoot out of the front, or they fall out of the front of the seed pod, and the plant propagates. Notably, when the seed pods are white and the seeds themselves are dried up in hard little brown clusters, that is when Datura is in its most psychoactive time. So this is also passing the information of when is best to ingest or to utilize this entheogen, right? Now here's an important part. I gazed upon this plant, with considerable interest, and as I was doing so, the burrs or shells commenced opening and shedding their particles, or the fruit which they contained, which was of dazzling whiteness. I drew near and began to eat of it. This is Lucy Mack Smith telling her the story about her husband having this vision quest where he goes and she's describing the Datura plant and he eats the seeds, the most psychoactive part of the Datura plant. After he eats it, he says, I found it was delicious beyond description, which the seeds themselves are very bitter, not recommended. And then he says, I presently turned to my guide and inquired of him the meaning of the fruit that was so delicious. Now, we don't know if his guide was, a physical person or if it was just a conjuration of his mind, an airy spirit that, according to Agrippa, right? He told me it was the pure love of God shed abroad in the hearts of all those who love him and keep his commandments. And users of entheogens will understand that phrase, the pure love of God. That's a very common phrase that psychonauts use. So Lucy Mack Smith reporting this vision of the way that she did fits perfectly into line with occult traditions of using coded and cryptic language and allegory to pass her prima materia to the next generations. I don't believe that Lucy Mack Smith faithfully remembered all of these exact details of Joseph Sr.'s dreams, but instead may have tweaked or fabricated these details in so much detail in order to leave breadcrumbs behind in this story for future generations, but only for those who know what they are reading. So I'm going to wrap this presentation by spending a bit more time with Datura here. Erowid is a data repository where people can send in their experiences with various plant medicines, particularly entheogens. It describes a wealth of data. Most of it is anonymized because most of these plants are illegal, right? But it has all of these self-reported experiences, and I want to highlight a few of these, just a few excerpts from these trip reports. The first one I want to read is titled The Stuff of Illusion, written by Merlin. And this is Merlin describing their third experience with Datura. Quote, unlike the first time, I remember what happened and I was halfway able to hold a sensible chain of thought. And unlike the second time, I tripped. I faded back and forth between dreaming with my eyes open and being awake. There were both auditory and visual hallucinations. I turned around and saw this gigantic woman standing a few yards away. Then she resolved into a dead tree. 1 minute, I was watching and listening to two creatures talking to one another, completely unaware of myself. Then the voices were gone, but I could still see the faces with their mouths moving. Then the faces resolved into leaves. That sort of thing was typical with the trip. Jimson hallucinations are built out of what I am looking at with my eyes. They add, this might sound fun, but remember all the time there is an uncomfortable physical feelings and thoughts tend to be disconnected. I was relieved when I started sobering up. The clumsiness and farsightedness were there like the first time, but less so. It is important to realize that Jimson weed is not classified as a psychedelic. It is classified as a deliriant. It causes delirium, end quote. Notably, some observers or some people who just read trip reports of these various psychedelics will claim that people have complete loss of memory, but that's not the case. When people have an experience, a psychedelic experience, specifically with these nightshades, memory can be very fragmentary and it can snap from one end to another, where time loses all meaning. You have no connection with the passage of time, and you have very vivid hallucinations that you very vividly remember, and then there will be just huge chunks of memory missing. So what these people are self-reporting are those points of vivid memory that they are able to recall after the experience. This is the story number 2, and this one is titled Delirium in Perdition. And it was written by Mushroom Magic, who actually took Datura with 2 friends, and all 3 of them ended up in the hospital because of it. Quote, I do not condone the recreational use of Datura at all. There's some strong language in this one, but I think it's characteristic. It's horrible. So kids, there is no need to eat Datura. Stay the fuck away from it. And if you do decide to try it, even after reading this report and or countless other train wreck experiences, then you are as dumb as I am. So then they go on to talk about, this is the experience after they were taken into the detox ward at the hospital. The delirium begins to kick in hard at this point. My girlfriend at the time suddenly appears next to me. I begin to talk to her and tell her that I am so glad she is here for me. Quite sadly, our conversation is short-lasting, and her body dissolves and shrivels into the shape of a black furry object. I look closely and inspect it for a moment, then realize it was only my black jumper. The weird thing is, as soon as I convince myself that I am hallucinating, reality slowly evolves, as opposed to the opposite tendency in many normal delirious states, where reality jumps out at me and then I register that I am hallucinating. That highlights that people who are using nightshades for these experiences, very often they don't remember that they are under the influence. They have to be reminded by their babysitter that they took the drug when they themselves are the one who ate the actual seeds, right? He continues, Datura seems to grant me the potential to control my hallucinations, whatever I please. However, my mind registers information at a slower pace than visual observation. So I have to be super aware that I'm under the influence of tropane alkaloids and that the hallucinations are just mind-induced in order to not be freaked out, or more or less to enjoy the visual and metaphysical interaction. A point that I want to make here briefly, when you're seeing these people who you aren't sure if they're real or not, you might begin to devise a test to determine whether that's a real person or whether that's just a hallucination, like maybe shaking the person's hand. They continue. Soon after, another ghost of my past visits, a good friend, Andy. Andy doesn't say much because normally he doesn't say anything at all. He sat there on the bed looking at the ground, hardly noticing my presence like he normally does. He always wears a black jumper. I call out to him as if he's on the other side of the road. He doesn't respond. As soon as I predict he is just another hallucination, reality hits me like a very slow crawling turtle. This time I predict his body is going to shrivel up and turn into the furry black jumper again, and voila, I didn't even need to inspect it 3 times. Learning all over again. Datura makes me feel a bit like a monkey placed in a scientific observation room, undergoing a trial and error test with Satan as the scientist. End quote. Final one that I want to share. This one I think really highlights how this kind of works out. And that last one, those experiences were all in a detox chamber with that person just sitting alone in a room in a hospital, right? Like everything the person experienced, it was all imagined. And his 2 friends ended up having shared hallucinations while they were in their own separate detox chambers. It's a really fascinating read. So the third one is Strongest Thing I've Ever Taken, Datura, written by Alter Ego. Quote, I remember things were strange, but didn't feel strange. I looked up and the sky was as blue as could be, but then dark clouds filled the sky and lightning started flashing in the sky. A woman's face appeared to me and I knew it was her, capitalized her. Notably, this person is having this experience inside of an apartment when they're looking up at the blue sky with, clouds and lightning flashing. The plants were an extension of her life force. She was calling for me. I tried to run, but then I was back in my friend's apartment sitting on the floor. I tried to get up. I needed to see the plants. I needed to do something or else she would have my soul. I remember walking towards the door, but not making it there. I would always forget what I was doing. And then when I got there, there was no door at all. I felt trapped. I needed to get out. I looked over and my friend was lying down on the couch with his eyes closed. I remember wondering if he was dead. And then I started to see his hair and fingernails grow really long. He appeared very old to me. Then I saw what was happening. She was taking him. I saw his eyes flash open just then, and it was normal again. I remember asking myself where my cigarettes were. Just then there was a knock at the door. It was my girlfriend wondering where I was. She had brought 3 friends with her, all people I had went to high school with in earlier years and had moved away. This did not seem odd to me at the time. I invited them in and we started talking about something. I can't remember what exactly. I reached in my pocket for a lighter to light my cigarette my girl had given me. But when I looked up, they were gone. I mean, vanished. The odd thing was, I still had the cigarette. I shrugged this off and tried to light the cigarette, but every time I tried, the lighter wasn't working right, or I'd forget what I was doing. I reached over to pet my dog, which is strange considering my dog died when I was 12, end quote. So anybody who's partaken of classic psychedelics or these more temperamental and dangerous plants like Datura, they quickly recognize the patterns emerge, and they've probably been nodding along this entire presentation. I know you're in the audience. I know you've talked to me before. I know you're out there. People who willingly take Datura, they see and experience these hallucinations based on the environment around them. And this is different from the visual and like the fractal hallucinations granted by classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, because Datura hallucinations are completely indistinguishable from reality. People interact with people or animals and objects that simply aren't there. And oftentimes the user forgets that they even took the dosage while they are having the experiences. And actual somatic symptoms are really consistent among all of these nightshades. Lethargy, a lack of fine motor control, dry mouth, a dissolution of spatial and temporal awareness, the inability to communicate or form coherent sentences, memory loss, dilated pupils, so on and so forth, just like what was described in all of these herbal remedy books from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And minor forms of these symptoms can remain for a few days depending on how powerful the dosage was. Simply put, Datura is super nasty stuff, but it will take the user's mind to places that are inaccessible without having that particular dosage. So, in conclusion, psychedelics as entheogens were used in 19th century occult traditions. If we grant the Smith magical worldview, and that members of the Smith family and the early church were steeped in occult traditions, entheogen use is an aspect of occultism that should not remain overlooked. Practitioners of the occult, they often coded their language and left breadcrumbs in the form of allegory for readers who would read those accounts with initiated or with spiritual eyes. And finally, historians don't have access to the divine. We simply cannot demonstrate that God did this or that as a working part of a historical model. For that reason, naturalistic explanations are required for the visionary era of early Mormonism under Joseph Smith's shamanism, as I call it. And I believe that the Smith entheogen theory provides that crucial piece of explanatory power. So anybody who is interested in learning more, I've co-authored or self-published an article titled Revelation Through Hallucination for Sunstone 2017. I also co-authored an article published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, which was very well received by the psychedelic audience who it was written for. And I've also extensively discussed this on Naked Mormonism podcast. However, some outside resources for information on psychedelics, which are really accessible to uninitiated readers: Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, The Teachings of Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge by Carlos Castaneda, and Plants of the Gods by Schultz, Hoffman, Ratch, Evans, and Christian, as well as the website Erowid, E-R-O-W-I-D. I'll also recommend an article that was published in Interpreter Foundation yesterday by Brian C. Hales, which provides a very helpful basis for the pharmacology of these various plants from somebody with extensive training and expertise in anesthesiology. The first half of the article is really, really good. And I'm always encouraged when I see other Mormon historians and researchers begin to learn about psychedelics. So if anybody has further questions, or you want to share your personal First Vision experiences, or whatever the case may be, I invite you to join the Psychedelics, Entheogens, and Magic virtual meetup this evening after the closing broadcast. That's where I'm going to be. I think Brian is going to be there. I know a few other people are going to be there. We can really discuss this and hash this out and answer any questions that we don't have any time to get into today. So thank you all for attending our presentation. Now I'm going to turn my time over to Brian, my co-presenter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bryce. Let me just warn everybody, don't ever fool around with she who must be obeyed. I couldn't resist that. Also, on a personal note, Brian Hales is the only person I've ever heard give a presentation who warned his audience, if any of you fall asleep, I will send you a bill. So anyhow, on to our gruesome and serious topic. I'd like to thank the Sunstone Foundation for this opportunity to develop and disseminate my ideas. When I first heard Bryce present on this subject a few years ago, I was immediately struck with how this was a very important and new line of research and a hugely significant matter that's been virtually overlooked because of cultural changes and shifts which have occurred in the time from the prophets where we are in our current time. As an introduction, I'd like to go through the role of hallucinogenics in society from prehistoric times to the era of the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. I'd just like to make one note, is that the drug regulations with which we are so familiar today actually only began to be implemented in the early 20th century. Up to that time, there were no guidelines as to what was legal or what was not. So we have to put aside some of the prejudices that we have accrued living and growing up in a society where, oh, this is bad and don't ever do that and so on, and try to look at this in the perspective of people who weren't living with any of those kinds of rules or regulations 200 years ago. In the first book of Nephi, the opening work of the Book of Mormon, there are good candidates for hallucinations. Hallucinations are clinically described as unusual activities in the brain where one experiences sensory perceptions which are not physically present. They have nothing to do with insanity, and in fact, they occur quite frequently in almost everybody in small amounts, almost all again and again and again. They often involve a chain of events, and Bryce alluded to this, where a mind-altering substance is taken in a safe and appropriate setting, which induces audio, visual, or other sensory perceptions based on suggestions of what should be experienced. Variations on this definition may be that hallucinations are possible in the absence of one or more of these elements. The instances of hallucinations in First Book of Nephi do not include a detailed rendering of just what substances may have been involved, although in at least one case, and Bryce alluded to this, there's a very strong hint as to what that substance would have been. So we need to content ourselves with a holistic approach where we look at the total experience and see how it fits the paradigm of a hallucination. We're never going to be a detective who's going to get back to what substance where and so on and so forth. In section 1, I will discuss the hallucinogenic substances from early times to the age of the prophet. Since prehistoric times, humans have used plant, fungal, and animal substances to induce altered states. Ancient engravings of the Hindu god Shiva reveal him doing a dance with cannabis flowers in his upper right hand. These flowers are also embroidered into the locks of his hair. In Christianity, on another note, Christ used products of fermentation, bread and wine, fermentation of dough from wheat and of grape juice as sacraments in his religion. Hallucinogens include psychic changes or induce psychic changes, which are so far removed from ordinary life that the experience resembles entry into another world. Bryce went into this quite well. Indeed, it's been supposed by Schultes that this may have been the origin in the idea of deity, or one of the origins among ancient and primitive peoples. In the evangelical community, prayer and other spiritual experiences are stressed as matters which must be learned and practiced. Once the practitioner becomes fully engaged in these experiences, suggestions about divine visions and dictates may go to the point of becoming fully absorbed. The absorption leaps from the imagination to become an hallucination in that the congregant actually sees and hears God or other paranormal entities. The mind leaps from imagination to hallucination, in the words of Oliver Sacks, who, by the way, specifically identified as a subject he felt in history had this property, Joan of Arc. He did not mention Joseph Smith, but he's a wonderful author on the subject. Joseph Smith Jr. spent his life on the frontier, moving in the course of his lifetime ever further westward from Sharon, Vermont, to Palmyra, New York, to Kirtland, Ohio, and then to Jackson County, Missouri, and finally to Nauvoo, Illinois. This world was dominated by storytelling, a medium which appealed to many in an age without modern media. It still plays an important role in society today. In the course of his youth, he invented a robust repertoire of stories about the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Americas, which were described by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, in the very work that Bryce cited earlier, biographical stories of the prophet Joseph Smith and his progenitors. Stories were also a vital part of the Native American culture of that time. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha is a famous example of a modern literary work based on this ancient lore. In the New World, this cultural significance of hallucinogenic plants was overwhelming, and it dominated every aspect of the lives of Aboriginal peoples, according to Schultes. In the course of his life, Joseph developed an extraordinary interest in Native Americans and their culture. A part of this culture would have been the lore of their shamans and the substances they used to achieve altered states. Also, there are indications that his father, Joseph Smith Sr., had experiences with these substances. In a dream related by his wife, this is a little bit different from the one that Bryce referred to, he sees a box and is commanded to eat its contents. He then beholds a fantastic flow of wild beasts, horned cattle, and roaring animals. Clearly, the implication is that the box contained hallucinogenics and that the visions were hallucinations. At the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and this is beautifully drawn out in a number of works and biographies of Joseph, the greatest number of visions in LDS history occurred. Many barrels of wine were drunk in the course of celebrating the sacrament, and many visions of Jesus followed. The transition from bread to wine, by the way, in the sacrament to bread and water today did not occur for many, many years after this. An explanation for these extraordinary visions may be the beverage was mixed with Datura, a well-known hallucinogenic nightshade family grown abundantly in the Northeast, and I'm going to leave it with that. The temple was an ideal setting, and the long list of prayers, incantations, and sermons provided the suggestions. Joseph was well known, as we know, as a treasure digger, and one of the things that may have happened during his nocturnal jaunts into the forest may have been he may have harvested some of these plants and fungi with psychedelic properties. In section 2, I will discuss the evidence of hallucinogens in the First Book of Nephi. In the course of this discussion, I will mention powerful hallucinogenic effects, which may be induced by certain plant substances when taken in the right dosage. As a warning, please note that many of these plants are highly poisonous, and even in small doses may cause serious illness and even death. These substances are not appropriate for self-experimentation. In the First Book of Nephi, it opens with 2 visions by Lehi. First, he sees a pillar of fire. As mentioned earlier, prayer. He prays and sees a pillar of fire. As mentioned earlier, prayer may induce hallucinations. He then returns home, lays down on his bed, is overcome by the Spirit, and has another vision. Here he sees God sitting upon his throne, surrounded by concourses of angels singing his praises. He then sees a lustrous being coming down from above, followed by 12 angels who go forth upon the face of the earth. The first gives him a book to read, from which he learns about the coming woes of Jerusalem. At this point, the vision peters off as Nephi's narrative turns to other circumstances. This vision corresponds well to what would be called, in modern terminology, a trip. After the vision of the pillar of fire, he retreats to the setting of his bedroom, where he can safely experience visions beyond the simple pillar of fire. Lehi is said to be overcome by the Spirit. In the early 19th century, sicknesses were often attributed to possession by an evil spirit, a change of state, as being overcome by the Spirit, and so on. So this overcome by the Spirit is a very significant word of kind of code language for what was going on. Joseph's contemporaries may well have read this as that Lehi had taken a mind-altering substance. His vision may have been seen as a hallucination with visual, auditory, and tactile components. He actually feels the book, as well as one with messages from the hallucinatory world. At this point, one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire work begins to unfold, where Lehi imparts to his sons that he has had a dream or a vision which took place in the setting of his tent. He sees a man clothed in a white robe and follows him through a dark and dreary landscape. This, of course, is reminiscent of what Bryce just narrated. He comes to a field in which there is a tree with a most desirable white fruit. As he partakes thereof, and he is filled with exceeding joy, he implores other members of his family to come and partake. Some do, and some do not. Other images emerge, such as the river, the rod of iron, the mist of darkness, and the great and spacious building. This white fruit is a good candidate for the white seeds of the Datura plant, and the state of exceedingly great joy, which is induced by eating it, for a substance-induced hallucination. Some details in the text which support this are that the fruit is never referred to as delicious at any time. Did an extensive word search on this matter. Rather, as being delightsome, as creating exceeding joy. This all suggests that the attraction was not based on the taste or smell, but on its effects on the brain. It was an external substance which could make one happy, i.e. alter one's state. This is not only one of the most extensive visions in the Book of Mormon, but moreover, it sets in place the perception that many of the visions are substance related and that it specifically identifies what substance is used, the white fruit, and what are its effects. This being established early on in the work, the reader is prepared to understand the link between substances and visions when similar events occur later in the course of the work. Remember, First Nephi is introductory. After the preaching is finished, the book notes that all of these, quote, all of these things did my father see and hear and speak as he dwelt in a tent in the valley of Lemuel. The tent was the setting in which Lehi could experience this extended trip, just as earlier he had experienced a vision from his bedroom. Nephi sits in the same tent and ponders these things. These ponderings constitute the suggestion which is needed for the hallucination. Once again, the tent becomes the setting for a vision. He relates that he is caught away in the spirit. As mentioned earlier, shamanistic knowledge was a part of the Smith family lore, and just as Joseph Smith Sr. shared his knowledge of substances with his son Junior, Joseph, now here in the work, Lehi shares his knowledge with his son Nephi. Nephi goes on to have the most extraordinary sequence of experiences where the ordinary perceptions are taken over and he is transported into altered states. In this extended trip, he finds himself on a high mountain where an angel bids him to look upon a series of things. He sees the tree of life, the city of Jerusalem, the Christ child, and there are many other things he sees. And for interest of brevity, I'm going to cut them out. I think people will recall the passage. In this extraordinary vision, Nephi has visions within visions, usually punctuated by the angel's command, look. Finally, after having seen all these things, he returns to the tent of his father, which was the setting for these visions in the first place. The visions are over. In section 3, I will discuss the great cultural divide which arises in 1 Nephi, ironically one that's still around today. In Lehi's vision, Laman and Lemuel do not partake of the white fruit, and this is greatly troubling to Lehi. Up to this point, the episode has had a character of frivolity, but now, for the first time, fear sets in. The white fruit contains the substance and needed to induce the visions. And if they will not partake of it, they cannot become visionary men like their father Lehi and their brother Nephi. Earlier, they murmured against Lehi, accusing him of being a visionary man. They did smite Lehi with a rod in frustration over their what they call visionary journey. In the course of this unfolding story, these two begin to murmur once again against Lehi and later instigate a mutiny against Nephi. Partaking of hallucinogenics versus not doing so is a cultural divide between the visionary and non-visionary elements of society. The later part of the book, in particular chapter 5 of the 7 chapters found in the original 1830 edition, revised later into more chapters and so on, but the original edition, in the chapter 7, they depict an active conflict between the down-to-earth figures such as Laman and Lemuel and the visionary figures such as Lehi and Nephi. As mentioned earlier, they label Lehi a visionary man, and they repeat this proof many times. The tensions reach a high point when Laman suggests to Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael that they slay Lehi. It takes divine intervention, the voice of the Lord, to quell this uprising. Nevertheless, these tensions arise again when Nephi is called a fool for his vision of building a ship, and again aboard the ship when a mutiny breaks out. Alas, the lot of the visionary man is not an easy one. In the end, however, the visionary world triumphs in that in following these visions, they successfully reach the promised land. In the final 2 chapters of the 1830 edition, chapters 6 and chapter 7, Nephi assumes a commanding role and preaches the way of righteousness. The message is clear. Visions lead the way to all progress. They may be contested and despised, but in the end, they are indispensable part of the divine plan for humanity, the Lord's way of communicating with his people through his prophets. In conclusion, substance-induced hallucinations are as old as humanity, and indeed the antiquity of these practices may have played a role in Joseph's desire to achieve the restoration of all things. His affinity with the aboriginal residents of this continent may well reflect a fascination with their rich shamanistic culture. Much of the behavior and experience of the early Mormon era suggests the use of hallucinogenics to attain theophany. The early 19th century readers of the Book of Mormon would have recognized in the language, the descriptions, and the context of this work, the very experiences with hallucinations which they themselves had had. The work creates an extraordinarily organic unity between the congregation's experiences and their sacred text's rich and varied world of visionary events. This book lays out the program for Joseph's life in many ways. It transplants the concept of the promised land from the Middle East to the New World. Joseph will be the prophet, and his vision will guide the way. There will be conflict between the visionary men and those who do not share this world. Yes, there will be controversy and trouble, but thus armed, the prophet and his chosen people will go about building the kingdom of God.
Wow. Now, Bryce knows me quite well, and Dr. Kassenbrock, you don't know me at all, but I am very rarely speechless. I feel cheated. I feel duped. I feel like I want to go get really fucking high.
Not yet, not yet. Gotta, you know.
Wait till
I
tonight.
gotta finish my right. Now, I'm a therapist and I can't promote this thing, so I probably just got myself in a really lot of trouble by even saying that. But I did come from California, where things are legal. So certain things. Wow, I'm blown away. The research, the depth, the sources, the first primary source material. It's unbelievable. I have never heard any of this before. Surprise. Thank you. Thank you.
The conflicts between the visionary and non-visionary, the Pharisees and the reformers, certainly.
There are a few questions. Some of them are kind of deep, and so I'm suggesting maybe that you guys go into the chat later and look at those. One question that is pretty interesting. We have about 3 minutes left, but we'll go along if we need to. This is too good to snip you guys off. Here's the question. One criticism I heard of the 2014 Noah film was that Noah took a substance to create a vision rather than having a real vision from God. Were substance-induced visions criticized as fake imitations of religious experiences by religious or other authorities in Joseph Smith's time?
That's a really, really great question. Really great question. And you got to remember, I would allude to what I mentioned before, that these substances were not illegal at all at that time. I wouldn't say everybody was doing it, but I would say it was very widely spread. It's still widely spread today, but it's illegal. So, you know, it's different. The point is that the use of them wouldn't have been looked at as unusual or something that had to be particularly noted. It was a matter of course.
And so this kind of reminds me of what you said earlier in the presentation, that we kind of need to take off our 21st century lens and
Yes.
allow ourselves to inhabit the mindset and the cultural milieu of the time.
Yes.
Bryce, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely the hierarchy of visionary experiences. And I'm reminded of the experience of Charles Finney, for example, a contemporary of Joseph Smith. He hit the preaching circuit about a decade before Joseph did. And he was, according to his own autobiography, I mean, he was racked with turmoil about having a profound and true visionary experience that was indeed endowed from God. And this is this is a debate or subject of debate in the psychedelics community of people who are able to exceed or achieve these altered states of consciousness, these visionary states of mind through endogenous processes, whether that be breathing exercises, whether that be just straight meditation. There are a number of or dancing, over exhaustion, Kama Sutra. People can achieve those without the stimulation or the catalyst of an exogenous plant material. And whether or not those are somehow differentiated or maybe superior to achieve those endogenously instead of exogenously, instead of just taking the shortcut of acquiring the plant materials that serves as the catalyst. I think that whatever, if you find the spiritual states of mind, these altered states of consciousness are something that you enjoy and that you take fulfillment out of and that you take value out of, getting there, the ritualism that is required to get there, if that's what you find fulfillment in, that's okay. If you want to take the shortcuts and just get there by smoking something, that's okay too. Be safe, do a lot of research, be safe. And I won't advocate for the usage of that because that would probably be illegal. I try to just be a purveyor of information, just do a lot of research on this. But there is that debate raging in the modern psychedelic community as well, just as much with the legitimacy of a God endowed vision for a religious leader, particularly if you feel the Great Commission, if you feel called by God and God appears to you through this visionary element. It was often, it was seen as a more legitimate version of a vision, as opposed to somebody who might wander out into the woods and partake of God's gifts there and achieve that, quickly and effectively with reliability.
Amazing. Parsing that out is amazing. So that kind of actually leads into this question, and I think I will make this the last question. What, if any, indigenous influence on Smith family use of entheogens have you found? So you did speak to Joseph Smith, having a fascination with Native culture, preaching to the Native Americans, and certainly the message of the Book of Mormon is centered around Native American history, the people that he found here. I think this speaks more to, well, I'll read the question again. What, if any, indigenous influence on Smith family use of entheogens have you found?
That's a very good question, and I I would talk more about, we know more about Joseph in some ways than the whole family, but also you need to realize that in that time, Pennsylvania was a Western state with many Indian populations. So one can fairly surmise that the Smith family, as they made this journey to which I alluded to from at first he was born in Sharon, Vermont, and so on and so forth, that they would have had contact, abundant opportunities for contact with Native Americans most of the time. And in fact, most of these contacts were quite peaceful. This was not an era of war and, well, maybe I better not, because
depends on where.
Andrew Jackson and his, oh God. But yeah, it would have been a part of the environment and the milieu. I'll stop at that.
And I'll just build on that by saying it should never escape our recognition that the first missionaries were sent to preach to Native Americans, right? And there's explanatory power there because Joseph was always seeking to build his religious empire. And if he could capitalize on the plight of Native Americans and of slaves in order to form his army for overthrowing the government, which ended up being his final end goals, if we, according to the Council of 50 and his running for president, but also the just inherent fascination with Native American groups. And one of the missionaries who joined the group that they picked up on the way through Kirtland out to Missouri was Frederick G. Williams, a Thomsonian herbal physician. And his later published ads in the Quincy the Quincy Whig reflect that he was an Indian and German root doctor, where he would advertise his tinctures and cures. So it was very clear that Frederick G. Williams saw the opportunity of the first missionary group headed out to Missouri in late 1830 as an opportunity to go mingle his herbal knowledge with the people who had been using the indigenous plants for thousands of years. And he capitalized on that opportunity, and then almost immediately after was called to the office of the counselor to the president, and then Joseph's son was named after Frederick Williams.
So it seems like the inverse would be almost harder to prove.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Joseph was fascinated by Native Americans, and in Nauvoo he had frequent meetings with Native Americans. And in our paper that we published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, we spend a significant portion talking about the possibility that he was coordinating basically a highway for peyote use, which holds some explanatory power for Richard Woodworth and Lyman White making frequent trips out to meet with Sam Houston and going down to Texas and scouting out a location for a new Mormon settlement right on the Rio Grande.
Quick word, very quick word, that in his diaries, which I've read through extensively, he refers to a meeting, but they can't get started because they're waiting for the Lamanites to arrive. No meeting of the saints was considered complete without a delegation from the Lamanites.
Thank you. We are scratching the surface, clearly.
Yeah. That's why we went way over time. Thank you for allowing us to do that, Maud. That was a lot of fun.
I'll push the powers that be around a little bit.
I
don't want to say. I don't want to. Yeah.
I was going to say just there's a ton. I just looked at the list of questions. There's a ton there. Each one of those questions we could do a whole new presentation on. Viewers, I encourage you to attend the psychedelics, entheogens, and magic virtual meetup tonight after the final presentation. We'll do our best. I don't know if Brian will be there. I hope so. But I'm going to do my best to field as many of those questions as possible there.
Okay. It's a Zoom meeting? Okay, so you'll email me the...
That is correct. Yep.
Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sunstone, for letting us squeeze a little more juice out of this turnip. This is amazing. I hope I didn't get too personal with my wrapping up comments, but thank you to the viewers. Thanks for Bryce and Brian for being available to be answer questions later on. This is remarkable. And again, thanks for coming to Sunstone 2020. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.